So please welcome Noam Kroll.
All right, guys. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. I'm going to be talking about my Final Cut 10 workflow with DaVinci Resolve. We just had a question from this guy over here about the Blackmagic camera, which is what I shot the film on. I DP'd this as well as edited and directed. So, while this does apply to specifically to the Blackmagic camera, it equally applies to just about any other raw workflow, whether you're shooting Red or Alexa or hacked 5D or whatever it may be. So I'm just going to jump into it. I'm going to give you a really quick background on myself because I think it will put things into context as far as why I think I took to Final Cut Pro 10. My original background was in finishing. I worked for a finishing house in Toronto before I eventually launched my own company. And I used a lot of very technical software, Nuke, After Effects, Shake, Final Cut 7, just about every NLE out there. And eventually, I launched Creative Rebellion, which is my company. It started out as a post house, turned into also a production company. And I found that my needs were really, it was really important for me to have access to a tool like Final Cut 10 that allowed me to turn things around very quickly. And that's something that Sam was just talking about, was the quick turnaround time. He was specifically talking about the metadata, which I'll get into a little bit. But for me, it's just generally the program was very fluid and very swift for me to use. And I was noticing almost immediately that my projects were turning around in many cases a fraction of the time, even on longer form projects. So I'm also an independent filmmaker. Aside from the commercial and corporate stuff that I do, I have my own films, and oftentimes these films are being done in my own time. And it's just as important for me to make sure that when I'm taking time away from my other work and from my regular business, that I use my time wisely, and I ensure that as much time as I can spend in the creative process of the edit, I do spend there, rather than troubleshooting and working around technical issues that I've had in many other NLEs that I've used. So with all that said, I'm going to play a little teaser for my film here. It's just a minute long. We actually have our lead actor, Timothy Lita Priest, came out. He's right over there. It's a dark, dramatic thriller. It's called Brother Sister. This teaser is actually in a slightly rough state. We're polishing it up soon, but I still wanted to share it with you now.
Do you ever think that maybe what happened to Mom wasn't an accident? Maybe she came out here just like us, but just didn't turn back.
Finish up! There's nothing out there for you. Understood?
Yes, sir.
Lives on an island in the middle of the sea. We live on an island in the middle of the sea. Riley, Riley, Riley in the middle of the sea. Who lives on an island in the middle of the sea?
Thank you. So the trailer, as well as the film itself, was cut in Final Cut 10. And first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about why. And I'll just preface my entire presentation by saying I will get into some technical details, but I think for a lot of people, it seemed earlier when Michael asked a question of how many of us are using Final Cut 10, it was maybe half and half. And speaking to the people that are and maybe are still on the fence, or the people that are not, I'll explain why I really like and why I think it's worth the chance and worth taking the time to learn. So for me, I think change can be a good thing. When Final Cut 10 first came out, I I really liked it. I mean, I saw it had some major shortcomings. Like I said, I came from a post house, and I could see the major concerns with laying out to tape and with a lot of the missing functionality that we're used to. But with all that aside, I still had Final Cut 7, I still had Avid, I still had all my other tools. Those did not disappear overnight. And you know, I did feel that there was something to it, so I gave it a chance. So that's why I started using it. But the reason why I continued to use it was because of the speed and the simplicity. When I first started really getting into it, I tried it out on smaller scale projects. So these may have been commercials, corporate videos, music videos, things like that, where I had the flexibility to experiment. There was a dramatic speed increase almost right off the bat, before I even knew how to really optimize my projects and organize using some of the metadata functionality that's in the software and a lot of the other tools. Just the ease of use, some of the basic fundamental features such as the magnetic timeline that I'll talk about later, the skimming functionality, all of these things just let me be more creative, let me flow right through my edit and focus more time on the creative process. And I also really liked the simplicity. Like I said before, I'm not intimidated by more complex software. I use, you know, on the most complex end is probably compositing software like Nuke, but there's something to be said about using a very simple interface, and I really do enjoy working in an environment that does not feel cluttered. I always describe it to people as, you know, if I'm doing work in a room that's really messy, for me personally, that's going to affect me, and I'm not going to get the same level of work out of myself as I will if I'm working in an environment that's clean and that's just conducive to more of a streamlined creative process. So with Final Cut 10, I find that they've really, you know, hidden a lot of these, in some cases taken away things we need to put back, but in other cases just taken things away and hidden them under the hood. So if we need them, they're there, but they don't necessarily get in the way of our day-to-day tasks. And I mean, ultimately, what I've talked about so far is why I got into it, why I stayed with it, but the reason why I'm continuing to use it after now a couple of years of usage is it's giving me the freedom to really try out ideas. And, you know, for example, on the film that you just saw the teaser for, we had a really tough scene to shoot where we had the script just wasn't translating to the shoot on the day of production. The runtime was longer, the content wasn't there, the messaging wasn't there, and we tried out a ton of new ideas and a ton of different things to try to get it where it needed to be. We ended up getting some amazing footage, but it was also very confusing, and it was very off base from our original concept. So in order to make it work, I really had to be cognizant of how to do this also in a timely manner, because we had our Sundance deadline coming up. So for many reasons, again, which I'll get into in a moment, it was a very easy process for me to try out new ideas, to use the magnetic timeline, to throw things back and forth, and to see what was working and what was not working very quickly. So again, I'll expand on that in a minute. I just brought up this screenshot. This is just my edit here, and I mean, as you can see, it's very clean looking. It's again, this is only a 10-minute file here, but this is pretty much what it looks like. I've done hour-and-a-half features, and they're very easy to use. I'm editing a 90-minute documentary right now as well in Final Cut 7, and I can tell you that it is, for me, painful to go back and look for footage and skim through things and try to make drastic changes and try out ideas after working in something that's this simple. So, you know, as for my process itself, obviously the first thing is the picture edit. So what I did with the Blackmagic camera was I brought in, we shot in RAW, so we shot 2.5K RAW, Cinema DNG, and I brought all of that into DaVinci Resolve. There's a number of other workflows you can use, and I'll touch on those later. But I brought them into DaVinci. I created my proxy files, and this was a very important step for the Blackmagic camera because for any of you that have ever worked with it, you almost have to overexpose the camera, and it would have been really, really hard to work with it had I not only generated proxies, but also applied a bit of a look to them and done sort of a one light pass on everything. So I went ahead and did that. I got the look where it needed to be. I then just ingested all of the ProRes. I did ProRes LT because I was going to be going back and forth between my Mac Pro and my laptop. So I brought my ProRes LT files into Final Cut Pro 10. I did the offline edit in there. One of the best features for me and one of the biggest time savers was the ability to sync the clips. And I believe Sam also touched on this a little bit, but it essentially, for any of you that have ever used Pluralize, it has that functionality built right into the software. So my first thing was I went ahead and synced all the clips. I labeled everything accordingly. It was within half an hour to an hour, I had everything organized and synced and ready to go. So it was very, very quick. I spent 80 to 90% of my actual time in Final Cut Pro 10 editing. And I often equate my experience editing in Final Cut 10 almost to, I always draw comparisons to music, because I find, for any of you that may play an instrument, it's almost like improvising. You have the ability to sort of improvise and be spontaneous in Final Cut 10 by manipulating the clips in a way that is really not possible in any other NLE that I've used. So after I had my picture lock, I exported a Final Cut Pro XML file, brought it back into DaVinci for color. This was more or less seamless. There were about 2 or 3 clips that did not come into DaVinci properly, and I knew why. I didn't have the time to go in and troubleshoot a solution for it at the moment, so I eventually brought in those clips individually. But essentially the issue was I had brought over audio from a different take onto one of my other clips, and DaVinci had read that and brought in video footage from the wrong clip. So anyways, there were a couple of slight glitches there, but 95% of it came in okay, so I worked around that relatively quickly and easily. So there's just my DaVinci setup, pretty simple, pretty straightforward for any of you guys that have used it. And if you're using any other color grading application, it's essentially the exact same workflow. The great thing about DaVinci is it accepts Final Cut Pro XML files. Right off the bat, I mean, they seem to support Final Cut 10 from the get-go. They were one of the few, Blackmagic's one of the few companies that seemed to really get it and want to make that effort to support Final Cut 10 right away. So that was great for me, and I find that the stability is only improved with each release. So that was great. Moving on to post-audio, this got a little bit trickier. We had a question earlier about how to get audio into Pro Tools. I did use X2 Pro, which is a very, very simple application where you bring in your Final Cut Pro XML file, and it generates an AAF file that you can then bring into Pro Tools. So I did use that. I actually am still using the original light version, and it has some less functionality than the full version, but it worked completely fine. We brought the session into Pro Tools without a hitch. Everything went straight in, no issues there. But we did have some issues that fell outside of the technical aspect. What ended up happening was our post-audio guy was, he had taken on a lot of work, as many of us in post-production do at once, and he had a very difficult time finishing what he needed to by our deadline. So the bottom line was we were scrambling to get this done. He was running out of time, and we had to look for other solutions. So one option was my composer, who also has a background in post-audio. He runs Logic 10. And we thought, let's experiment a little bit with the FCP XML workflow into Logic 10. So that's exactly what we did. Sent over the file. I sent over all the source audio, everything that he would need, as well as the Final Cut Pro XML file. Unfortunately, it did not work at all. So it came in completely. I wish I could have had. I was actually trying to get him to give me a screenshot so I could bring it here, and he didn't. I'm pretty sure he put the file as far away as possible, but it just didn't work. There were a lot of issues with it, and again, like some of the issues I had before, we had a deadline coming up. I didn't have 2 or 3 days to go and troubleshoot and figure out why that was happening. In fairness to Logic and to Final Cut, it could have been something that could have been rectified on my end. I don't know at this point. It does. Okay, so we're hearing it doesn't work yet. So at least it wasn't my fault. So what I ended up having to do, which became a bit of a nightmare, was the only option, we were down to 12 hours before having to deliver the cut. So I had to actually edit the audio myself in Final Cut Pro 10. There were actually some pros to doing this, and on corporate productions and commercials and things where I have to turn them around quickly without round tripping to Pro Tools. I actually think it's not a horrible solution. Some of the plugins, some of the Logic plugins, some of the functionality for audio, I actually think is pretty good. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of that because that's really its own topic. But what I will say is, as a whole, I feel like out of everything in Final Cut 10, that's probably what needs the most work, at least for my day-to-day usage. It's very clunky. I find, some of just the trimming functionality. You can expand and collapse clips to show the various audio channels, as many of you probably know, but it's clunky and it doesn't really work as in a fluid way, in my opinion, as the rest of the timeline does. And you sort of, at least for me, I would expect more given how well the functionality of the video editing works. So anyways, I was able to get what I needed done. It was not perfect by any means, and we're going to have to go back into Pro Tools. But the tools were there, and I really am hoping that they address this in 10.1, which I believe will be released sometime in December, hopefully with the new Mac Pro. But it was done, and ultimately it came time to do the final finishing. I had all of my new color files back in from DaVinci. There were a couple of clips that needed a little bit more work, but really, really minor tweaks, so I actually did that right within Final Cut 10. This is sort of coming full circle to what I chatted about before with you guys, which was my background in finishing. Although Final Cut Pro 10 is by no means specifically a finishing tool, to me it feels like it's almost headed in that direction in a lot of ways. It has sound, it has color. A lot of these things don't work at the level that they could or should yet, but in many ways I was able to do a lot of extra finishing work within Final Cut 10 without really blinking an eye. One of those examples is doing some minor color adjustments. So that was done. I then laid in some credits and titles, which again was really, really great. This is, I think, a strength with Final Cut 10. You can, manipulate the titles right on the screen. It's right on the canvas, I should say. It's extremely simple and effective. If you want to go the extra mile, you can also publish your motion templates and bring those into Final Cut, which I did not do for this, but have done in the past. And then my final delivery. So everything that I had to do was essentially by this point in Final Cut, including the delivery, not only my data master file, but also even my DVD. I did everything straight from Final Cut. It worked very, very quickly, and the delivery is one of the areas where I really saw speed. Again, this is a short film that I'm talking about now, but I've I've rendered out hour-and-a-half feature films out of Final Cut 10 that have gone exceptionally quickly, one of which was shot on a Red camera. And on my blog, actually, I have an article that I describe my Premiere workflow for my first feature film, which was shot on Red, and I cut in Premiere. And one of the big mistakes that I made in doing that was cutting the R3Ds natively, because when it came time down to our deadline and I had to go and export my hour-and-a-half movie, now I had to go and recompress 90 minutes of Red footage. And with various different projects that I've done within Final Cut 10, some of which are using native Red footage, some of which we're using ProRes 444 files, the speed was completely unmatched on my system by any other editing system that I'd used. So that was pretty much it. I mean, overall, I had a very, very positive experience with Final Cut 10. I wouldn't have changed anything about what I did other than giving myself a little bit more time for the audio. For those of you that don't use DaVinci, don't want to use DaVinci, but have a Blackmagic camera, have another camera that shoots RAW, both Photoshop and Adobe After Effects are good tools. My first project I shot on the Blackmagic just for a learning experience for myself. I actually brought in using Camera Raw within Photoshop. I did some color correction. I did my adjustments in there. I batch applied it to all of the various files that I needed to. Essentially the same works with After Effects. You could bring in your image sequences in there. So you've got plenty of options. But I find for those of you that are working with Blackmagic footage, I mean, it's sort of a no-brainer. DaVinci is, it's going to work natively with that footage very, very well. The camera is built to be used with DaVinci. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that's shed a little bit of light for you guys. I'm going to open it up in a second here to a Q&A. And just so you know, I'll just, plug in my blog and my company site here. noamkroll.com. I put a lot of time into this site to share sort of both production and post-production tips and tutorials. I'm going to start doing a lot of video reviews and stuff like that soon. And my company website and email and everything is below.